Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Story Survive program about Annelies and Marianne Bernstein. My name is Sydney Yeager, and I'm the Public Programs Coordinator here at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a memorial to the Holocaust. Now in its 25th year, the museum is committed to the crucial mission of educating our diverse community about Jewish life and heritage before, during, and after the Holocaust. As part of that mission, our programs illuminate the stories of survivors, broader histories of hate and anti-Semitism, stories of resistance against injustice, and more. Thank you for joining us today virtually. We hope that you will visit the museum in person to see our new core exhibition, The Holocaust, Hate Can Do, alongside our temporary exhibition, Survivors, Faces of Life After the Holocaust, from photographer Martin Scholler, which is running through June 18th. You can learn more and find tickets on our website. We also appreciate the vital support of our members so much here at the museum. If you want to get closer to the museum and enjoy exclusive programs, member previews to exhibitions, and free admission, you can explore museum membership on our website or email membership@mjhnyc.org to learn more. Closed captions are available on today's program, and instructions on how to turn captions on or off will be posted in the chat, in addition to all the links I've mentioned. If you have questions for our speaker during the program, please put them in the Zoom Q&A box, and we will get to as many as we can at the end of the hour. Today, we are honored to be joined by Dr. Richard Lutjens. Richard is an associate professor of modern European history at Texas Tech University in Lubbock, Texas. He specializes in modern German history with a focus on the Weimar Republic, Nazi Germany, and the Holocaust. And his research examines the experiences of historically and socially marginalized groups during these periods. His first book, Submerged on the Surface, The Not So Hidden Jews of Nazi Berlin, 1941 to 1945, examines the daily experiences of life in hiding for the 1,700 Berlin Jews who survived the Holocaust by fleeing deportation and living in the shadows of the capital of Nazi Germany. Through an examination of survivor testimony, his research argues for a re-examination of hiding as a category of Holocaust analysis, demonstrating that contrary to popular opinion, Jews in Berlin did not hide in the traditional sense of the word, but were constantly on the move and actively engaged in securing their own survival. So thank you all for joining us today. And now I'm going to hand things over to Richard.
All right, Sydney, thank you so much. Hopefully we have that up. Thank you for the introduction. I appreciate it. Thank you and for all the hard work that you put into setting this up, and to Treva Walsh, who has helped me out by giving me a number of pictures that you will be seeing today of the Bernstein sisters, and of course to the Museum of Jewish Heritage for inviting me. I'm especially honored to be able to share with you the story of Annelies and Marianne Bernstein. Their story was one of the very first I encountered almost 2 decades ago when I first began studying hiding in Germany, and it has long resonated with me, not only because of how powerful their story is, but because of what it says about the nature of hiding in Germany, which is quite different than what most people tend to think. Anneliese and Marianne were one of approximately 6,500 Jews in Berlin who, between 1941 and 1945, escaped near certain death by fleeing the Nazis and going into what is usually referred to as hiding. Approximately 1,700 of them managed to survive in this manner. Now, they referred to themselves and were referred to others as U-boats or submarines, or sometimes as divers. And very true to the city's reputation for wry humor, they refer to the act of hiding as submerging or diving, not going into hiding. And when the war was over, they used similar imagery. They talked about resurfacing. Survivors only use the term to hide when they were physically concealing themselves. And in Berlin and in Germany more broadly, that occurred with far less frequency than one might assume. And much like Jews in hiding describe themselves as U-boats, or the act of going underground as submerging, their stories tend to contradict our image of what hiding was like during the Holocaust. Indeed, in Berlin, people rarely hid, and their daily lives included everything from running from the Gestapo, stealing food, seeking shelter in a wide variety of locations, to evenings at the opera, billiards at the local pub. One survivor even purchased a sailboat and used to go sailing. For most people, it is a combination of the above. In other words, then, hiding, at least in Berlin and Germany more broadly, is anything but. It is characterized by personal initiative, adaptation, and constant interaction with the Gentile populace, as much as it was by persecution, flight, and concealment. It's a combination. And this definition of hiding was the norm in Germany. And as you'll hear today in the story of the Bernstein sisters, it very much describes their experiences. So Anneliese and Marianne, this is a picture of them post-war. Here is a picture of them as children. They were born on November 30th, 1922 in Königsberg. This was the largest city in East Prussia. And their story, in many respects, their childhood, represents that of the solid Jewish middle class ideal of the 1920s. Her father was a respected and well-known banker in the city. Anneliese and Marianne, along with their little brother Benno, had a lovely childhood, a very nice home. They had a summer home on the Baltic Sea. In Anneliese's own words, not wealthy, not poor. And overall, Anneliese goes to great lengths to stress her amazing childhood, how very close-knit she and her family were, and how that love sustained her during her worst moments. And in speaking of the strong love she bore for her family, she noted, and I quote, "Under the darkest circumstances, I always thought of love. And that helped me, and that made me survive things that today I ask myself, how was it possible?" Those dark days began most certainly for Anneliese and Marianne when the Nazis came to power in 1933. But even in the waning years of the Weimar Republic, Anneliese already noticed that the atmosphere had begun to change with the rise of anti-Semitism and the Nazis. And this was especially true in East Prussia and Anneliese and Marianne's home city of Königsberg. And she remarks in her testimony that East Prussia was, and I quote, "very tuned into Hitler." And that regarding the Nazis, again, I quote, "East Prussia did everything first, then most of the country, much sooner, for instance, than Berlin." And she was right, as you can see in this slide of the March 5th, 1933 elections. East Prussia was one of the most Nazified regions of Germany, already, in fact, before the Nazis came to power, with regions of East Prussia voting almost 2/3 for the Nazis. Now, almost coinciding with this rise and compounding the tragedies that would follow, Anneliese and Marianne, their brother and their mother, experienced the death of Anneliese's father when he took his own life in 1933. He was falsely accused of what Anneliese calls wrongdoing. Of course, she was quite young and she doesn't go into details. But considering the time when this occurred and the fact that family friends told her father he would never get a fair hearing, I think it's safe to assume that there are anti-Semitic grounds for the accusations, the false accusations made against him. Now, the tragic death of Anneliese and Marianne's father and the simultaneous rise of the Nazis is going to, in Anneliese's testimony, really mark the end of her idyllic childhood. And from that point on, things grow steadily worse. The death of Mr. Bernstein put the family in a difficult financial position, and the family was forced to move into her grandparents' house, where a couple of aunts were still living. Schooling became a nightmare in the newly renamed Adolf Hitler School. For the Bernstein family then, as for so many other Jews, emigration becomes the only guarantee of safety. As such, and you can see this picture from Berlin from 1935, the Bernstein family is going to do everything that it can to escape. In 1937. Their mother is going to send the sisters to Berlin to take a course on dressmaking in the hopes that having this very practical skill set might make emigrating easier for her daughters. Berlin also, with its over 4 million inhabitants at this point, is also going to provide the sisters and many other German Jews who are relocating to Berlin during this time with far more anonymity than they had in smaller cities and towns and villages. And although the Jewish population in Berlin by this point in time had shrunk by almost half since 1933, it was at around 160,000. Still, around 100,000 Jews are still calling Berlin home. 1938, however, is going to witness the start of ever more violent and radical policies designed to force Jews from German soil. Nazi determination to rid the country of its Jewish population will finally explode on the night of November 9th, November 10th, 1938, in what is known as Kristallnacht, the night of the broken glass, a wave of terror and violence against Jews that had not been seen in this region of Europe since the Middle Ages. The events of Kristallnacht are going to mark a turning point for the Jews of Germany. There's going to be this break with the more stop and start policies of the Nazis. Most historians recognize that this is sort of the breaking point. From here, everything will become radically and much more quickly violent. This will, in many respects, also justify in the minds of many German people that the government has the right to use violence against Jews. And as such, any remaining illusions of safety are going to vanish, as did the idea of a Jewish future in Germany. And every Jew and Gentile alike knew it. And so, for example, observing the turmoil of that night around her, the non-Jewish journalist and future righteous among the nations, Ruth Andreas Friedrich, she wrote in her diary, "Now I know it. The war against the Jews has begun with an attack across the board." And indeed, in historical hindsight, the events of Kristallnacht, again, are going to presage the imminent war against Europe's Jewish population. In her memoirs, another future U-boat named Inge Deutschkron, she remarked, and I quote, "For the German Jews, even the most German among them, the events of November 9th were an alarm signal. Some believed it was now 5 minutes before 12. Actually, for most of them, it was already 5 minutes past 12. Too late." And indeed, when Heinrich Himmler ordered the halt to all emigration of German Jews in October of 1941, over 70,000 Jews, including the Bernstein sisters, remained trapped in the capital of Nazi Germany, this country now bent on their extermination. As a consequence of Kristallnacht, back in Königsberg, Mrs. Bernstein sent her 14-year-old son Benno to Riga in Latvia, where the Bernsteins had family. Unbeknownst to the sisters and the mother at the time, they would never again see their brother, who was killed by the Nazis when they invaded Latvia in the summer of 1941. As for the sisters, hopes of emigrating were also dashed when they, like most able-bodied Jews in the city, were sent to forced labor in the city. Although Anneliese was still allowed to live in her own apartment, as were the vast majority of German Jews, she still had to commute daily to the ammunitions factory, where she worked in a segregated unit for Jews cut off from the non-Jewish workers. In addition, as one of the many consequences of Kristallnacht, as you can see in this slide, she now had to put the middle name Zara on her identity card. And for men, it would have been Israel. Now, Marianne can't go to this same factory. Marianne is nearly blind. And so she was taken in for a home for the blind and put into forced labor there. Anneliese recalls that her own foreman was a, as she says, simple Berliner who was as decent to the Jewish workers as possible. However, his supervisor was a member of the dreaded SS who delighted in humiliating the workers. For example, Anneliese noted in her testimony that he didn't just make the workers wear one Jewish star, as became policy in Germany in September of 1941, but four, one on the front of their shirt, one on the back, one on the right arm, and one on the left. Moreover, Anneliese and her co-workers were routinely humiliated. Their particular task was, this was an ammunitions factory, was spray painting the ammunition gray. And if anyone started shaking with nerves, this SS man would spray them in the face with the paint, even though the paint was toxic. The non-Jewish workers were given masks for this task. The Jewish workers were not. And yet, despite the humiliation and indignities inflicted upon her, when the first deportation of Jews left Berlin on October 18th, 1941, headed to the ghetto of Lutjens in Poland, only the sisters' position as forced laborers is keeping them safe and protecting them from deportation. However, as the Nazi Empire spreads throughout Europe, foreign laborers from the occupied territories are going to be shipped back to Berlin. And as a result, more and more of Berlin's Jewish population is going to lose their jobs and therefore their protected status as workers. I should note that some employers would step in when somebody received their deportation notice and testify that they were an essential worker, thereby prolonging their stay in Berlin, but that was by no means guaranteed. Slowly then, as 1941 fades into 1942, Anneliese and her sister notice that more and more people are being taken away. Everyone noticed this. The question is, where are they being taken? It's really only as 1942 begins and cryptic letters begin arriving back from those already deported that the Jews of Berlin, eventually including the Bernstein sisters, came to realize, eventually at least, that Nazi code words such as resettlement, evacuation, in reality, they mean death. I use the term eventually because Anneliese and Marianne, like so many others, in the early phases of the deportation, had no idea what this actually entailed. And in fact, when her mother received her deportation notice in 1941, Anneliese recalls thinking, okay, deportation means forced labor. It doesn't mean death. And as such, she and Marianne requested that they be deported with their mother. They actually went to a Gestapo agent and said they would like to be deported. The agent's words or response to Anneliese, and I quote, "You get out of here. I am going to send you when I want to send you and where I want to send you to." And so they were turned away. And as surprising as this might sound, especially knowing what we know now in hindsight, in my research, I've encountered a number of survivors who initially requested to be deported with their families and were also turned away. And so this is not necessarily unique to the Bernstein sisters. By the end of 1942, the tenuous existence of Berlin's remaining Jewish population had grown dire. The Gestapo had stopped giving Jews advance notice of their deportations. Initially, throughout 1941 and the first quarter of 1942 or so, one received a letter in the mail saying, this is the time and place of your deportation. This is what you may bring with you. Please show up. Now the Gestapo has changed tactics. They are going to give no notice in order to forestall Jews from either submerging or taking their own lives. And suicide among the Jewish community in Berlin had reached epidemic proportions by this point in time. The Gestapo is now going to show up without warning, blocking off entire apartment buildings, factories, and immediately notifying individuals that they have sometimes an hour, sometimes 2 hours to pack, and that they would be immediately deported. Jews and non-Jews alike then knew that Jewish life in the city was fast approaching. And really no later than the fourth quarter of 1942, most people who chose to see knew that death awaited in the East. In fact, on December 2nd, 1942, that same journalist, Ruth Andreas Friedrich, she opened her diary that day with a bleak entry, and it read, "The Jews are submerging in droves. Dreadful rumors concerning the fate of the evacuated, from mass shootings to starvation, from torture to gassing. No one can voluntarily expose oneself to such a risk." As a result, Anneliese and Marianne, like thousands of others, began to actively contemplate submerging underground. The problem is that they didn't know quite how to go about doing it. Anneliese knew that she and her sister, of course, would have to take off the star, change their names, flee, but the logistics of it all was difficult to figure out. And since they were rather new to Berlin, they had far less of a group of friends, social network, than many other future Berlin U-boats. Luckily, however, the owner of the factory where Marianne worked was a good man, friendly, to use Anneliese's words. And he offered to find the sisters a place to hide when they made the decision to dive. The Bernsteins' first lodgings as U-boats were with the madam of a brothel, who knew the sisters' true identity and, much to Anneliese's surprise, lived within sight of the main police headquarters in the city. Unfortunately, Anneliese and Marianne could not stay for long, however, as the woman's husband was an ardent Nazi, and he was returning from the front on leave. And this happens in a number of instances with U-boats in Berlin. And so after 3 or 4 weeks staying there, Anneliese and Marianne were again on the run, sleeping mostly in railroad stations or at changing booths in swim clubs. As Anneliese said, we were always on the run. And again, this was incredibly common. The average U-boat had more than 7 different shelters during their time underground, and on average, over 20 different helpers. And so, again, moving around, you never quite know where you might be. One night you might be staying with the Countess Maria von Malzahn, who took in many Jews. The next night you might be staying in a rat-infested cellar. The next night in a telephone booth, in one of the city's 10-cent toilets, in the park. One never quite knew where the next shelter was going to be. What the sisters ultimately needed then, if they were going to have a decent chance of evading arrest, was false papers. False papers, though, presented their own host of difficulties. Firstly, most false papers were acquired on the black market. The black market attracted lots of U-boats during the war years and also resulted in a great number of arrests. And yet, even if Anneliese and Marianne had wanted to brave the black market, which could be found really in every neighborhood in the city, the cost of false papers was exorbitant. Decent false papers costed on average 2,000 Reichsmarks. I've encountered some testimonies where the cost was close to 6,000. Anneliese and Marianne do not have this amount of money. And so Anneliese takes a different tack, one that shows that she, like so many other U-boats, knew exactly what kind of system they were dealing with and how to manipulate that system to their own advantage. Although all Germans were issued an official identity card, Germans could also make use of what was known as a Postausweis, a postal identity card that functioned as a sort of Ersatz ID card, and which was generally recognized by the German authorities as a secondary form of ID. As the air raids over Berlin begin to ramp up, beginning in March of 1943, it was not at all uncommon for Germans to then go to their local office to file for a replacement postal card, as they had lost theirs during one of the bombings. Knowing this to be common practice, in early 1943, most likely March or April, Anneliese went to the head office and explained that she and her sister had lost everything in the most recent air raid. Considering that by the end of the war, roughly 80% of Berlin was destroyed, Anneliese's story is going to raise no real suspicions. All the official asked was that she and her sister come back the following day, and although risky, Anneliese and Marianne did just that. Anneliese had already located the most bombed out street that she could find and located the last name Stein on one of the buildings. And she told the official that was her name. And although the official was, Anneliese noted, somewhat suspicious, Anneliese used what she called psychology and managed to cajole and charm the official, who also happened to have twin daughters, into issuing 2 postal ID cards that would serve the sisters well in the coming years. They were now officially Anneliese and Marianne Stein. And again, although this was incredibly risky, what one sees time and time again in the stories of the U-boats is that one has to be a bit gutsy. One has to take risks. In the words of another former U-boat, one needed, and I quote, a little chutzpah and bluster. Nor is this the last time that the Bernstein sisters are going to take great risks to ensure their survival. As Anneliese said in her testimony, which was given in 1991, and I quote, "When you want to save your life, you do things that you don't know before it happens that you could ever do them." And yet, despite the acquisition of these incredibly valuable ID cards and even her work ID card, Anneliese constantly stressed in her testimony that survival was tough, that there's little food, that they're constantly on the move and living in perpetual fear. They did know of a few other U-boats scattered about the city, but as many survivors mentioned in their testimonies, they all tried to avoid one another because although survival living submerged was often tedious and lonely, the risk of betrayal and denunciation meant that the U-boats tended to avoid one another. And according to Anneliese, this avoidance was generally mutual because there was always a chance of running into one of the Jewish spies and informants working for the Gestapo, also known as, colloquially, as the Snatchers. That's what the U-boats tended to call them. In the spring of 1943, after the last major deportations from Berlin, the Gestapo established what was known as the Jewish Search Service. They did this in only 2 cities, Vienna and Berlin. And in Berlin, the Jewish employees of this search service were tasked with tracking down the city's estimated 6,500 U-boats. The exact number of individuals arrested by these snatchers, these informants, is unknown, However, in 1950, for example, the East German police charged in absentia Rolf Isaacson, one of the most notorious of the Jewish informants in wartime Berlin, with having betrayed upwards of 250 submerged Jews. His accomplice, the even more notorious Stella Goldschlag, also known among the U-boats as the Blonde Poison, was responsible for at least 100 arrests, and estimates go as high as 600. Even if the other snatchers were far less aggressive, far less successful in tracking down submerged Jews, their actions as a group account possibly for as many as 1,000 arrests of all U-boats. These U-boats then were acutely aware of the presence of these informants, and survivors frequently mentioned the dangers that these individuals presented. As a result, over time, U-boats will learn to avoid certain cafes, theaters, the opera, which was quite popular at one point, restaurants and bars where other U-boats tended to be. In the end, the safest way to avoid denunciation then was to limit one's contact with other divers, or at the very least to avoid sharing addresses and names. And so despite the risk, or despite rather the comfort that came with socializing and speaking freely with other Jews, the risk that one might be speaking with an informant or a future informant was too great. And although surviving the war often required putting one's trust in strangers, submerged Jews learned to divulge no more than was absolutely necessary. And yet sometimes, as Anneliese and Marianne found out, it was unavoidable. One day, the sisters encountered a man on the streets of Berlin who recognized them and who presented himself as a fellow U-boat. His last name was Rachman. He had been a theater director in Königsberg before the Nazis came to power, and he remembered the sisters, he said, because when twins were born, it was a big deal, especially considering that the Jewish population in Königsberg was only about 3,500 before the Nazis came to power. So the sisters, believing his story, quickly entered into a conversation with him and made the mistake of divulging where they were staying at the moment, which happened to be with the family of Marianne's fiance, who was considered by the Nazis to be of so-called mixed race and therefore was able to escape deportation. Soon thereafter, Rachman, who in reality was a Gestapo informant, arrived with 8 Gestapo officials to arrest the sisters. Fortunately, they were next door at neighbors, and they were able to escape arrest. But Anneliese noted in her testimony that Rachman is going to pursue the sisters for the next year, although to no avail. The dreaded informants of the Jewish Search Service, however, were not the only threats to denunciation that Anneliese and other U-boats faced. Anyone could recognize you. So, for example, at one point during her time submerged, Anneliese worked as a waitress at a cafe in the Berlin suburb of Oranienburg, right by the Sachsenhausen concentration camp. One of her fellow waiters had taken an interest in her, a very clearly sexual interest in her. And although she told him to keep away, his behavior became markedly more aggressive after Anneliese ran into a dishwasher from her former Jewish finishing school. In hindsight, Anneliese strongly suspected the woman of informing on her to the co-worker, although she does not quite explain how this might have come about. The man, however, offered Anneliese an ultimatum. As she put it, sex or Sachsenhausen. Choosing, in her own words, the lesser of two evils, Anneliese had sex with him and soon discovered that she was pregnant. Through word of mouth, she was able to discover a midwife who performed abortions by injecting soap into the uterus. She received, she says, 2 or 3 of these injections before the abortion succeeded. However, the afterbirth did not pass. And one day, suffering from stomach cramps, Anneliese managed to convince a friend who was again of so-called mixed race status and therefore not deported, to let her stay with him for the night. And that night, Anneliese began to hemorrhage. Sitting on a pail while the blood poured out and desperate by this point, Anneliese called the hospital, but they refused to see her before she had first seen a doctor, which was nearly impossible for a U-boat. Fortunately, however, later that night, the afterbirth passed, the bleeding subsided. The next morning, Anneliese dressed and left, and she did not see a doctor until after the war. The terrifying encounters with Rachman and with her co-worker served as a warning to the sisters. As Anneliese said, we knew now that the net is growing closer and closer, and so the sisters decide to leave Berlin. They first make for Vienna, but a stranger on a train, for unknown reasons, warns them against going to Vienna. They then decide to disembark at the city of Breslau, where they made their way into the countryside, pretending to be bombed out refugees from Berlin, and the mayor of the town found them work on a local farm. Even still, the sisters were officially registered with their false passes in Berlin, and it was back in Berlin where they needed to return every so often to get their ration cards. Anneliese, like a surprising number of other Berlin U-boats, developed an ingenious strategy to procure her ration cards. First, she would wait for an air raid, which by 1944 had become almost a daily occurrence. Then she went to a heavily bombed neighborhood in the city in order to apply for post-bombing relief. She would stand in line, and to make it less dangerous, she would ask the people in front of her and behind her where they had lived, so as to avoid giving the same address. And when her turn in line came, she gave a different address of a bombed out residence and received her temporary ration cards, which were generally good for 2 weeks. Still, the move is dangerous, and before each trip back to the city, Anneliese told Marianne that if she didn't return by a certain date, that Marianne should assume she had been caught and should turn herself in. This nearly proved fatal once. In August of 1944, Anneliese recalled a particular trip she made back to Berlin to collect new ration cards. She had left Marianne at the farm where the two were staying. A chance meeting on the train, however, delayed Anneliese's return. Against all reason, and she could never, even decades later, understand quite what motivated her to take the risk, Anneliese confided in the man her Jewish identity. She left the train with him, and he provided her with food and, as you can see here, an official travel pass, certifying that Anneliese worked for his office and that her position required her to travel. In the meantime, however, she had forgotten to send word to her sister. She raced back to find Marianne, in her words, close to insane. Marianne had been preparing to turn herself in. Only Anneliese's last-minute return prevented this fatal decision. And in fact, despair at times plagued the sisters, as it did so many other U-boats, and despair is incredibly difficult to recover from. But in addition to the hope that her mother would survive, what really sustained Anneliese and Marianne during this time was each other. As Anneliese recollected, and I quote, "Very, very often, death seemed so much better than this kind of living. And my sister would say, let's stop it. Let's throw ourselves under the next train. And not that I was stronger, but whoever was a little weak, the other one gave support to. And I said, what if our mother goes through hell and she comes back and she won't see us?" Meanwhile, the farm had become too dangerous. The front was moving nearer. Soldiers were being quartered on the farm now. Although the farmers knew the identity of the sisters and protected them, somehow the captain of the soldiers, who appeared to Anneliese to be a very dyed-in-the-wool Nazi, discovered her true identity. The day before the sisters intended to leave the farm for good, the captain called her in to have a word with her, and Anneliese assumed that it was all over. What he did next, however, shocked her. He offered her a cigarette. Anneliese couldn't believe it and asked the captain how he could praise Hitler day in and day out and talk about the upcoming German victory and then stand there before her. He replied in Anneliese's own words, "I want to tell you something. I haven't met many Jewish people and I have pictured them different. But," he said, "you are a hero and I wish you luck. And why did I talk the way I talked is because I couldn't in front of my men say anything against Hitler or against the war." Not everyone the sisters encountered, though, was like the captain. And as her encounter with him demonstrates, looks and titles could be deceiving. Once, Anneliese found work with her sister, this is again 1944, taking care of 5 children on a large farming estate, again near Breslau. Anneliese secured the position under the guise of needing a vacation from the bombings in Berlin, and she had hoped that the man would not be a Nazi. His name had a von in it, signifying aristocracy, and Anneliese assumed, as so many people at the time did, and even to this day assume, that somehow German aristocrats were anti-Nazi or less Nazi. This man, however, proved to be an ardent Nazi who monitored anti-Nazi sentiment throughout the local population. But according to Anneliese, his estate, for that reason, was a very safe place to live. Nobody would suspect a Jew of living there, and the local villagers, moreover, were frightened of him. Anneliese, moreover, had earned the man's respect one day by admitting that she was not really a secretary, as she had claimed. Instead, she led him to believe that she worked for the Gestapo, thereby gaining his respect and his approval. Anneliese and her sister stayed with the family for 6 weeks, and during this time, she balanced her work on the estate, again with trips to Berlin to collect ration cards. She had once again developed an excellent system to do this. Operating under the guise of an agent of the Gestapo, Anneliese told the estate owner that she needed to return to Berlin every so often to complete a task for her secret job. In return, her Gestapo boss in Berlin granted her 4 extra days off for her vacation in the countryside. This lie ensured that Anneliese and her sister could extend their stay in the countryside while simultaneously continuing to receive ration cards and escape the dangers of Berlin. Yet the sisters could not prolong their stay forever, and soon they gave their notice. In gratitude for her excellent work, her boss gave her a gift. It was a bar of soap made of what he told her was, and I quote, Jewish bones from a concentration camp. He said a friend had sent it to him. Anneliese, in her words, took the gift expressionless. After another short stay working as maids for a professor in Breslau, whom Anneliese described as quite spacey and perfectly nice, the sisters again returned to Berlin. By this point, the German front was collapsing on all sides, and it was in Berlin that the sisters waited out the terrifying final weeks of the war in an apartment recommended to them by a friend who knew that the sisters were Jewish. By this point, it must have been close to April or so. The sisters are going to have to take almost daily cover because by April, the Soviet army had reached the outskirts of Berlin. The blast of guns is nonstop, and the sisters ultimately had to leave the apartment and take shelter in a basement with Marianne's fiance to wait out the end of the war, to wait out the arrival of the Red Army, the Soviet army. And while liberation did come, it was not what the sisters were expecting. The Battle of Berlin, waged between April 16th and May 2nd, 1945, is going to bring a whole new host of threats for the sisters, for all the U-boats, and for the city as a whole. Caught in the crosshairs of Nazi and Soviet fighting, Jews and non-Jews alike perished in flame and by bullet in the now contested and ruined city. Exact casualties are unknown, But recent historical estimates put the number of German deaths, soldier and civilian, at approximately 325,000. Soviet death estimates range widely between 78,000 and 305,000. How many U-boats perished during this time is unknown. This long-awaited liberation was thus fraught with danger. Jewish women feared rape at the hands of Soviet soldiers. Jewish men risked being shot as Nazis by the Soviets or as deserters by the Nazis. Proving one's Jewish identity was not easy. Rape in particular, though, was the major threat facing Anneliese and Marianne. In the closing months of the war, the conquering Red Army raped between 1.1 million and 1.3 million German women, including Jewish women who had survived the horrors of Nazism, just to find that their liberators were not what they had imagined. The sisters, like many Jewish women, left the shelter of the basements and moved to the top floor of apartment buildings in the hopes that the soldiers would not bother to come to the top floor. This was a very common tactic in Berlin in these final days. Throughout the city, female U-boats recollect hearing the soldiers screaming for women, and the women they found screaming in turn. In the final weeks of the war in Berlin alone, over 100,000 women were raped. Finally, on May 8th, 1945, the war in Europe ends, though, and Anneliese and Marianne were able to again resurface and take their real names. So too did the remaining 1,700 U-boats of Berlin, who had managed against all odds to survive the horrors of the preceding years. As for the nearly 80,000 Berlin Jews who were, or over 70,000 Berlin Jews who were deported to the ghettos and camps, only 1,900 ever returned. The end of the Holocaust and the destruction of Nazi Germany was what, of course, historians and those who lived through it refer to as liberation. But in light of Anneliese's testimony, I'd like us to think today seriously about what the word means. And that's because I would argue all too frequently, people tend to equate liberation with happy ending. That's certainly an attitude I have to address in my classroom when I teach the history of the Holocaust. Because as almost every survivor, either those from the camps or those in hiding will tell you, liberation and happy ending are not the same thing. Liberation, as the historian Dan Stone reminds us, was a process. One that for many of those who survived took years. And for many survivors, full liberation never fully arrived. To be truly liberated is not to be just set physically free from the horrors of Nazism, but to be set emotionally, intellectually, perhaps even spiritually free. For those like Marianne and Anneliese, who lost almost everyone they loved in the world, for all the survivors who lost entire families, this isn't a happy ending then. It's an ending, to be sure. It's a resolution. It's welcome, but that doesn't mean it's happy. And although U-boat memories of liberation are quite diverse, depending on the quality of the experience they had while living submerged, Anneliese remarked at the end of her testimony that as a consequence of all she had experienced and everyone she had lost, that a part of her had died. She still hoped for happiness, but there was also great loneliness because she knew so few people who understood her experiences. And on that note, I will just conclude with leaving you with some of her last words on the subject. Although she wanted to survive the war, if you asked her if she was happy she survived, Anneliese replied, and I quote, "I could not give you an unqualified yes." Thank you for being here to listen to the experience of the Bernstein sisters, and I would be happy to take any questions that anyone might have.
Thank you so much for that, Richard. That was such an amazing and, very moving story to listen to. So thank you for sharing that with us. So I'm going to share a couple of the questions that have come in while you were presenting. So the first one we have is, I wonder if you could expand a bit more on why the sisters returned to Berlin at the end of the war, given all of the danger that that presented, and why they didn't remain in the countryside instead.
It's difficult because a lot of survivors in Berlin returned to Berlin towards the end of the war, which again, considering the Battle of Berlin, we might ask why. Partly this has to do with the fact that even when people left Berlin, Berlin still functioned as sort of a base, a site of survival. So with the Bernstein sisters, it's the ration cards in part that they can still get food. And this is where their contacts happen to be. And so this seems to be for many a safer place. Of course, with the battle, it's not. But again, as a base of survival, what you see in the final years, or the final weeks of the war, is people returning to Berlin. That's where they started their time, and it's where they're going to end it. But again, in particular for the sisters, it's the ration cards and it's the contacts. And in many cases too, it is still easier to hide in Berlin, in this nearly bombed out city, than it is going to be to hide in the countryside.
Right. Thank you. We also have another question. Could you clarify if their mother survived or not?
I'm so sorry. No, she did not. No, she did not. And what we know, she was deported. Well, what precisely happened to her, we do not know. But that is, listening to Anneliese's testimony, this belief that her mother might survive is going to weave in and out of her testimony and really give her hope. And what one encounters with so many survivor testimonies of those who went into hiding, this hope, this belief that family will return, is what sustains so many people. And yet in so many cases, nobody returns. Or even in the very earliest testimonies given in the summer and fall of 1945, people are still waiting. And so their testimonies end with this note of, I don't know yet, but if they don't return, I won't have anything to live for. And so this, among the loss of her brother and her father and so many family members, this loss of her mother very much stays with Anneliese.
Yeah. I know that your research mostly focused on the sisters during the war, but do you have a knowledge of what happened to them post-war?
Well, in the late 40s, they do go to the United States. They stayed in Berlin for a bit, actually in the home of a high-ranking Nazi. They sort of took over his home, and said, you took our homes, we will take your home. And at first, there's some sort of debate. Do we stay? Do we go? And many U-boats had that debate. The behavior of the average German in the immediate years following the war is going to convince the sisters, as well as many U-boats, there isn't a home for us here. And so they head to New York. Anneliese, she does get married in the 50s, 1951, I believe. She did have a child. She and Marianne were attached very, very close to the day Marianne passed away in 1987. She does say, and she's very brief about her time after the war, that she hopes to be happy. She would like to end her life happy, but this is difficult to deal with. I will say that I don't want to get into too many details. She does say in her testimony what happens after she arrives and leaves Germany, I should say. She can't really be shared without express permission. And so to respect her and her wishes, I won't get into great detail, but they both did go to the United States, to New York.
Thank you. Before we get to our final couple of questions, I do just want to shout out this comment in the chat from Peggy, who is the daughter of a Berlin U-boat, who said thank you for this fabulous and comprehensive presentation, and that her mother went to school with Stella Goldschlag, and Goldschlag denounced her aunt's boyfriend, and that she had heard stories about her growing up as far back as she can remember. So thank you so much, Peggy, for joining us today. So then we also have a question about your research, kind of specifically your research methods. How many people or testimonies did you examine for your research? And how did you come up with the data that the average U-boat had 7 different shelters and an average of 20 helpers? How did you get there?
So for those 2 particular statistics, I am grateful to other historians who have worked on hiding, including Wolf Kluna, and he's done a lot of the major work, as well as the Memorial to the Silent Heroes in Berlin, those who helped Jews hide. But as for the broader data, in my research, I look at gender and age and when people went into hiding. I looked at, of 1,700 estimated survivors, I looked at 25% of testimonies, which is about all I could find. I did check with a statistician who said that's a good convenient sampling. So, and it does seem to work with other estimates being made by historians, but many of the early testimonies, people are asked for restitution, when did you go into hiding? And so there's a specific date usually associated with that, which allows me to then, collect the data necessary.
That's amazing. That's a crazy amount of people to examine. So that's really interesting to hear about. So I know we are almost at the end of our hour, and I always like to end our Story Survive programs by asking, what do you hope that people take from the stories of the Bernstein sisters, and I guess the U-boats more generally, and if you have any other final thoughts that you'd like to share?
Well, sort of the broad takeaway, I hope, is that hiding is not this hiding is found throughout Europe, but it's very location specific. And so if I were to have given a talk on hiding in Poland, for example, or in the Netherlands, you would see people much more physically hiding. And I think, if one thinks of hiding, it's, Anne Frank and her family very much, sort of signify or represent the hiding paradigm. But in Berlin and in Germany, people are they are not just being hidden or taken in, they are actively engaged in their own survival. And it's because they know Germany. They know the system. They can work the system. They are very much, this is an open existence in some ways. And with my book, Submerged on the Surface, I give credit to that title to another U-boat. That is what she titled her unpublished memoirs, that she is submerged on the surface, because they are out there. You just don't know if there's a U-boat that you're talking to or what is going on. And so I'd like people to take away from this that this is not a passive act, that those engaged in submerging are very much, although they had plenty of help, are very much responsible for their own survival too. And just one last thing, as we're reaching the point, maybe in 10, 15 years at most, with the survivors gone, please any stories you have, even if it's something you remember from your grandmother or your mother or a neighbor, even if it's only one part of a story, a paragraph, a sentence, write it down. Especially with the increasing rise of anti-Semitism now, it is all the more important that we keep these stories alive. And so even if you don't know the start to finish story, just write down what you know. That is essential to making sure that these stories remain alive, and that Anneliese and Marianne don't become sort of a side note or an anecdote, but part of this bigger history that we have to keep remembering.
Thank you so much, Richard, for joining us today and for this really amazing presentation and for answering all of our questions. It's really been such an honor to listen to you.